Sophie Hardy in the Internet Implant by Emma Dale. Narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 22. Agents in Training. A few more steps down the white corridor, Clara stopped again, this time at a monitor that seemed to be randomly placed on the wall. It was black at first, but as Clara lifted her hand up to it, a few lights began to flicker and words appeared that Sophie couldn't quite make out. Clara busily pressed buttons on a touchpad under the monitor and words flashed up on the screen at some speed. Sophie had seen her at school typing on a laptop, something adults no longer needed, and she had never been that quick. After a few seconds, Clara finished what she was doing and turned to look at the pair of them. "Ready?" she asked, as if Sophie and Yasmin were expected to know what she was talking about. "For what?" Yasmin asked. "This is the playground. It's where all the agents that ever worked here were trained, both mentally and physically. It contains computer-generated copies of levels from every computer game, film, myth, legend, television programme, historical battle and book that Mr. King and Miss Sissons could programme. Each of them presents their own unique challenge and tests the agents in different ways to make sure they are made of the right stuff." Clara really was turning into quite the tour guide. "So it's a test?" Sophie asked astutely. "Sort of," replied Clara. "More of a training exercise." "So, what do we do?" Yasmin always liked the idea of a challenge and seemed excited. "Well, we pick an exercise, I explain what you have to do, and in you go. Finish the objective, and you move on to another one that will help you to improve as agents. Do you want to have a go?" Clara made it sound so simple. "What do you think we should do?" Sophie turned the tables quite quickly on Clara and put the focus back on her. "I think I know just the one to start you off." Clara set about typing on the pad again. After a few presses, she was ready. "Now, don't worry, you can't get hurt." All of a sudden, the smile was wiped off Yasmin's face. She had no intention of even thinking about getting hurt. Now she was wondering what exactly was behind the door. "This is the Asterian Labyrinth. It will test your physical speed, thinking skills, problem solving and survival. It will try and play tricks on your mind, but just remember, none of it's real. It's just like playing a computer game. Got it?" Sophie and Yasmin both nodded. "Think so," said Yasmin, not quite sure as she had been. "So, what's our objective?" Sophie asked. "Just survive in there for 3 minutes." Clara smiled. "Survive?" Before Yasmin could worry any more, Clara had opened the door and pushed them both in. "Oh, and nobody has ever managed to finish this level on their first attempt," Clara said as the door shut. Sophie and Yasmin found themselves in a narrow alley. On both sides of them, about 10 feet tall, were solid grey bricks, which were completely smooth, and any thought of trying to climb them would be pointless. In front of them, stretched out for about 100 metres, was a floor of a brown clay-like substance. Yasmin turned around to look for the door that Clara had pushed them through. It had gone, and had been replaced by another 100 metres of brown clay and 10-foot-high walls going in the opposite direction. Yasmin was about to say something to Sophie when they heard a noise. It wasn't one either of them liked the sound of, a huge banging sound, like metal on stone. Sophie noticed that the walls shook as the sound reverberated around them and surmised that something had hit the wall with an immense force. Sophie stood stock still and didn't flinch. Yasmin looked decidedly more nervous. The vibrating of the wall stopped and was replaced by something new. Clomp, clomp. Footsteps. Loud, heavy footsteps. For something to make a noise like that on a clay floor, it must have been huge. Along with the footsteps was another noise, a kind of grating sound, like something being dragged along the floor. Taking all this in, Sophie turned to Yasmin. "Asterion, I know that word," Sophie said in realisation. Yasmin looked to her left in thought. "I remember my dad using it before in one of his stories." Sophie looked back to Yasmin, wearing a look of someone who had worked out an answer that they really didn't want to know. Asterion was the real name of the creature that lived in the labyrinth. It wreaked havoc in Greece, killed hundreds, if not thousands of people that it found wandered into its maze. "You mean body of a man, head of a bull?" said Yasmin, now realising what Sophie was going to say and remembering one of the myths that her dad had shared with her. "The Minotaur." The grating got louder, as did the footsteps. They were getting closer, almost directly in front of the pair of them now. Bang! The walls vibrated again, and this time the ground shook violently. From a gap in the wall, about 20 metres in front of them, a figure began to emerge. It must have been 10 feet tall like the walls. The first thing to appear from around the corner were the horns, which rose up higher than the walls themselves. They were long and piercing, but battle-worn. These horns had done some damage in the past, and were looking to do some more. Then came the nose. Through the middle of it was a huge silver ring that had droplets of blood spread around it. From its mouth hung drool. This beast was hungry, and the slobber dangling from its lips like honey from a beehive. Most striking, though, were the red eyes. Like balls of flailing fire, they instantaneously saw Sophie and Yasmin and latched onto them. The Minotaur had their scent. Sophie and Yasmin continued to edge backwards away from the monster, but they were hypnotised by the brute in front of them. The rest of the bull appeared. He was wearing armour over one shoulder and padding across his human shins. Behind him, he dragged the source of the scraping noise, his axe. The blade alone was the size of Sophie, and the handle it was attached to was the height of her and Yasmin on each other's shoulders. Now in full view, the Minotaur stopped in the centre of the alley and glared at the two aliens who had dared enter his labyrinth. Raising the axe above his head, he let out the most ear-shattering roar that the girls had ever heard. As he did so, he brought the axe down and swept it to the side into the wall to send another thunderous, threatening message to Sophie and Yasmin. The girls didn't need telling again. They turned the opposite way and ran for their lives. Finding a gap in the wall, Sophie and Yasmin turned sharp right and paused to catch their breath. Behind them, the noise had faded slightly as the Minotaur hadn't kept pace with the girls, but it was still gradually growing louder again. Struggling for breath, Yasmin stuttered, "Who defeated the Minotaur?" "It was Theseus in the myth. Who knows which agent it was from Shadow and reality," Sophie replied, thinking back to what her dad had told her. "But he had the sword of Aegeus, and I can't see it lying around, can you?" "OK, so if we can't defeat it, then we have to get out," Yasmin exclaimed. "No, Clara said the task was to survive for 3 minutes, not to find a way out here or defeat it. The Minotaur hunting us is the challenge, not the idea that we have to defeat it." In a perverse way, Sophie was enjoying herself. The contest had been set and she was applying logic to everything she had seen and heard. All those years of reading and listening to her dad were paying off. The thud of the Minotaur's steps was getting louder and louder, closer and closer. He let out another booming roar and thumped his axe against the brick walls. Sophie closed her eyes and tried to think, hard. "We have to keep running," Yasmin said, having caught her breath. "Agreed. Let's find another turning." Sophie turned and darted away from the oncoming destruction that was the Minotaur. As soon as the girl started running again, Sophie noticed that the Minotaur's footsteps had quickened as well. The thuds had got closer together and the dragging sound had sped up as well. An idea popped into Sophie's head. She slowed down in an effort to test it out. "What are you doing?" Yasmin turned around and shouted to Sophie. "Trust me," she replied. She was sounding more and more like Clara had done since they found her. As Sophie predicted, the Minotaur's footsteps had slowed down as well. Sophie decided to then stop completely. The Minotaur slowed down again, but didn't stop completely like Sophie had. The thunderous steps were now the same pace as when they had started. Also slowing right down, Yasmin had noticed the same thing that Sophie had. Sophie nodded at Yasmin to show that they were both thinking the same thing. "So what happens if we walk towards it?" Sophie asked. "Do we really want to find out?" Yasmin replied. "Clara said it would test our thinking skills and problem solving. Running away just makes it run faster. Stopping makes it slow down. We can't just keep running full pelt for 3 minutes. It'll catch us because it's just much faster than us. We need to think differently. We need to go towards it. It's only a game. It can't hurt us." Yasmin could think of nothing else to contradict Sophie and so reluctantly had to agree with her. Together, the pair turned to face the demon. The turning they had come down was about 10 metres behind them, so they both started to slowly walk towards it. As they walked, the soft sound of the clay beneath their feet became much more pronounced. Sophie listened for the Minotaur. The footsteps had ceased, as had the dragging, but what the girls could hear now was the deep breathing of the huge brute. In a way, it scared them more than the footsteps and the dragging, because now they were moving towards it. At least it felt right, running away from it. Sophie and Yasmin knew that in just seconds they would be in mere metres away from their hunter. "What if we just slow right down and barely move, but do actually keep moving?" Yasmin asked. Sophie shrugged and stood still, shuffling her feet ever so slightly in the direction of the turning. From around the corner, the Minotaur picked up one of its feet slowly and placed it down, very slightly in front of the other. "He's still coming," Sophie realised. "We have to keep moving, properly." Eventually, the girls reached the final turning. With a huge amount of trepidation, Sophie walked cautiously around it. Stood about 3 metres in front of her was the Minotaur. It was so close that Sophie could smell the incredible stink that emanated from him. It smelt disgusting. Flies hovered around his face and he just stared ahead beyond Sophie and Yasmin. Still edging forwards, Sophie took in the greasy hair and muscular build. This truly was an enormous creature. Sophie could almost reach out and touch him, but she still crept closer. Yasmin was slightly further behind, but again still moving. The Minotaur did not react to their presence. He simply stared forwards above Sophie and Yasmin's heads, apparently oblivious to anything going on around him. He was the keeper of the labyrinth, and nothing was going to get away from him. Sophie could now feel the heat coming off him. It warmed her face, but the stench was still foul and really overpowering. Thoughts flooded Sophie's mind. This was what she wanted from her life, to experience the mythical creatures that the adults had forgotten. This was so much more than she could imagine. The idea of what her dad would say if he knew what she was doing made her smile. Every other person on the planet was just wasting away, staring at a screen, and here was Sophie experiencing something amazing like this. The rest of the world was welcome to their pointless existence as far as Sophie was concerned. If Sophie had the chance in that exact moment, she would have complimented King on exactly how well he had coded the game. It truly was like facing the real thing. Reaching the point whereby, if she moved again, she would be moving past the Minotaur and therefore away from it again. Sophie didn't know what to do. Her only option was to touch his hand. She very slowly reached out her hand towards his. Nerves were beginning to take hold of her. She was shaking almost uncontrollably, and her breathing had stopped after she took one sharp breath in. She took his immense hand and could feel the blood pumping through him. At that point, the Minotaur looked down at her. There was a new softness in his eyes. Sophie relaxed and breathed out. Half a second later, though, and the Minotaur had picked up his axe and brought it down on Sophie. The previously bricked-up walls and clay floor had turned to black, and a door appeared behind Sophie and Yasmin. It flung open, and in it stood Clara. "You were so close! I didn't get anywhere near that close on my first attempt," she screeched excitedly. Sophie and Yasmin looked baffled. "How long did we last?" Yasmin asked. "Well over 2 minutes. You realise really quickly things that Mr. King says lots of people miss. Loads of adults just run away and try to keep going for 3 minutes, but he always catches them. You spotted that you had to go close to him. Just wait until Mr. King sees this. You really are going to make excellent additions to the shadow team." Sophie and Yasmin were still out of breath from their experience, and so didn't say half the things they wanted to. Clara did point out that because they were in their avatars, that the sensation of being out of breath wasn't actually real and was just a natural reaction, but neither Sophie nor Yasmin felt that particularly helped by that remark. "I've already seen it, Clara. Very impressive, Sophie and Yasmin," came a voice from down the corridor. Sophie and Yasmin stepped through the doors out of the playground and saw Miss Sissons coming towards them. "I knew this was the right decision. I've said it for a long time now. We don't need adult agents, especially those who just want glory and praise. Children are where the future is." Yasmin and Sophie were practically beaming now that they had caught their breath and heard such amazing praise from one of the people who had devised everything around them. "Where are we going now, Clara?" Yasmin asked excitedly. "Can we have another go in there, on a different game?" Sophie also chimed in. "No," said Miss Sissons rather sternly. "Now it's time for you to go home. Yasmin, your dad is due back from work in a few minutes, and Sophie, your mum and dad will be wondering where you are if you don't get home soon." The 3 girls all looked rather disappointed. They'd had such an amazing time since they'd turned up at Clara's house to find her. Their lives had changed so much, and they'd seen a side of the world that not many people got to see. The come-down of having to actually go home and do normal things was going to be hard. "All this will still be here when you get back. It isn't going anywhere." Miss Sissons did her best to reassure them, but their excitement and enthusiasm was at a fever pitch. The 3 of them working together, saving the world from anything that came their way. Bring it on, Sophie thought to herself. Eventually, the girls admitted that enough was enough and that they had a responsibility to their parents as well. The 3 zoned back into Clara's bedroom, which they had left some 3 hours before. Clara walked them downstairs and opened the front door. The 3 hugged and said goodbye to each other. It felt so good for Sophie to have her cousin back in her life. She had missed her tremendously, and to not just have her back, but to have her back like this, was greater than Sophie could have possibly imagined. "Thank you again," said Clara, as they said goodbye. "That's what we're here for," Yasmin replied. "Wasn't there something else you wanted to show us?" Sophie remembered. "Yeah, Zapfor," Clara replied, "but believe me, that's best saved for another day. Say hi to your mum and dad for me, and I'm guessing my dads will be in touch with her soon." "Will do." Sophie hugged her cousin again. In the front garden, Clara's dads were busy tidying up what had become of their lawn. The tall grass had been just about trimmed back, and the place was beginning to look back to normal. Clara spotted them and sprinted out into the garden and hugged them both. Sophie waved to her uncles and set off on the journey home. It had been a very eventful day. Sophie raced back home and burst in the door. The first thing she wanted was her mum and dad. She found them both in the kitchen getting tea ready. She threw her arms round them, and they didn't quite know what to say, so they didn't say anything and made the most of having the affection. "Tea in 10 minutes, Dad said. "Clara says hi," Sophie replied. Amelia and Tom looked at each other as Sophie left the room. Amelia followed and told Tom to stir the beans. She shouted after Sophie, but she didn't listen. So Amelia just sat on the settee and zoned out. Whilst eating tea, Sophie noticed the flashing red light in the corner of her eye, meaning she had a message waiting. Not ready to reveal to her parents that she had an implant, she finished her tea, thanked her parents and scurried off to her room. Her mum and dad were so distracted by the jolly happy girl who ate with them that they were oblivious to anything being amiss. "Where are you going?" Tom asked. "Homework," Sophie shouted whilst walking into her room. "Don't disturb me." Amelia and Tom just smiled to themselves. It was great to see their girl smiling again. Once in her room, Sophie shut the door behind her and lay on her bed. She stared at the space just in front of her, and the words, "One message received," became clear on the white screen. Sophie clicked on it and read the message. "Sophie, ask King where the agents really are." The message remained unsigned and there was no name in the sent box, but Sophie suspected she knew who it had come from. She forwarded it to King, Clara and Yasmin, who messaged back almost immediately with the same thing, Mr. Houghton or Dale Nathan. They were going to need a chat with their head teacher, and the sooner the better. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by Emma Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a hard copy of the book, then be sure to check out www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.